Next, C-SPAN's Politics and Public Policy Classroom features Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol, who talks to students about political journalism. It's just over an hour.
On behalf of the students at Pace University in Midtown Manhattan and the students at the University of Denver in Colorado and at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, we want to welcome our distinguished guest today, Bill Kristol, who is the editor and publisher of the Weekly Standard. And just back from Pace University, you were there a few weeks ago.
I was there the Friday before 9/11 of this year when the Pace had a very interesting conference on 9/11 5 years after. It was a pleasure to be there.
It was organized by Dave Caputo, who's the president of Pace University. And by the way, some of those programs are available on our website if you want to check them out from cspan.org. But what I want to do today is we want to talk about the war in Iraq and then frame the discussion with an eye on the midterm elections. There was an interesting editorial that was written by Bill Kristol in the Weekly Standard. Some of you may have had a chance to look at it. But as a way to kind of figure out where we are today and where we're going in November of 2006, I want to take you back to the evening of September 11th, 2001. President Bush, in his first nationwide address following the events of September 11th, and I ask you to listen very carefully to the way he framed the discussion and the debate that followed with an eye on Iraq.
The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
So, Bill Kristol, was that the benchmark to go into Iraq?
Well, it was the beginning. I mean, the first principle he enunciated was we hold terror-sponsoring states responsible for the terrorists they sponsor. He then developed that theme in the September 20th speech to Congress and in the State of the Union speech in January, where he broadened, in a sense, the agenda in a couple of ways. He focused more on the danger of weapons of mass destruction. That wasn't a focus of that very first speech. And he also began to really, I think through the need to change the dynamics of the Middle East. The decades of policies, of U.S. policy of propping up authoritarian governments and seeming to pursue stability in the Middle East had produced a false stability that under the surface there were these terrible currents that were building up that, so to speak, exploded on 9/11. So I think the president, like any leader in this kind of circumstance, spent the next few months coming to grips with the magnitude of the change of 9/11.
You heard this argument, you're one of the neocons. First of all, how do you define a neocon, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's a good thing for me. A lot of the people who attack neocons think we're terribly evil and I guess some kind of conspiracy. No, but my father was called a neoconservative back in the early 1970s. It was a term of criticism by Michael Harrington, who was a democratic socialist, and my father sort of took the term and said, okay, a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. And that was very much applied to domestic policy, especially in the 70s, rethinking the Great Society, rethinking some various big government programs. Also true in foreign policy, that you need to be strong as well as working with other nations and promote democracy and all of that. The term kind of faded away by the 90s. Most of us who might have started off as Democrats or liberals had been absorbed into the Reagan coalition. Bob Kagan and I wrote a piece in 1996 in Foreign Affairs. We called it Toward a Neo-Reaganite Foreign Policy. And it basically articulates some of what later became the Bush Doctrine: American strength, American leadership, promotion of democracy, possibility even of preemption, that kind of thing. We didn't use the term neoconservative or neocon then. It just sort of faded. It came back big after 9/11, and if people want to call the point of view that I express a neoconservative, that's fine with me.
But this letter that was written to then President Bill Clinton in 1998 basically saying, hey, take out Saddam Hussein, signed by you and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and a lot of other familiar names in this administration.
Yeah, I'm not sure Cheney signed that letter, but
But he supported,
it's
he
confusing.
endorsed
There are so many different letters that we got people together for. And, well, no, look, I mean, Clinton himself, the Clinton administration had the position that there needed to be regime change in Iraq. Saddam was challenging us. The president almost went to war with Saddam and did go to war in a limited way, of course, at the end of 1998. We thought that we were trying to encourage the Clinton administration to deal with the problem now and not let it fester and grow. But people make it seem like that was such a crazy idea. Of course, I mean, it was very much being debated on the floor of the Senate, and the Clinton administration indeed wanted regime change in Iraq, and they bombed Iraq. They were unwilling to actually go and remove Saddam.
What I want to do is I want to share with you a speech that we covered, we didn't cover, but we have aired from the archives of the National Archives, delivered in 1965 by another Texas president, former Texas Senator Lyndon Johnson, who was president in 1965, talking about the Vietnam War. And again, listen carefully to the language that President Johnson uses with regard to Vietnam, and then I'll come back and ask Bill Kristol if there are any fair parallels to Vietnam to what we are seeing today or may have seen in the last 3 years in Iraq.
Tonight, Americans and Asians are dying for a world where each people may choose its own path to change. This is the principle for which our ancestors fought in the valleys of Pennsylvania. It is the principle for which our sons fight tonight in the jungles of Vietnam. Vietnam is far away from this quiet campus. We have no territory there, nor do we seek any. The war is dirty and brutal and difficult. And some 400 young men, born into an America that's bursting with opportunity and promise, have ended their lives on Vietnam's steaming soil. Why must we take this painful road? Why must this nation hazard its ease and its interest and its power for the sake of a people so far away? We fight because we must fight if we're to live in a world where every country can shape its own destiny, and only in such a world will our own freedom be finally secure. We're also there because there are great stakes in the balance. Let no one think for a moment that retreat from Vietnam would bring an end to conflict. The battle would be renewed in one country and then another. The central lesson of our time is that the appetite of aggression is never satisfied. To withdraw from one battlefield means only to prepare for the next. We must say in Southeast Asia, as we did in Europe, in the words of the Bible, "Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further."
There you have it, Bill Kristol. Take out Vietnam, insert Iraq. Take out soldiers, insert insurgents or terrorists. Is it a fair comparison?
Well, there are an awful lot of differences. Obviously, a different world 40 years ago with the Soviet Union fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, whereas here, Iraq really is at the center of the threat we face from jihadists.
But he
in
says
the
we
Middle
can't
East.
cut and run in Vietnam.
Yeah, well, it would have been better to win in Vietnam. Now, maybe in retrospect, we could say that it was never winnable. I'm not sure that's true, but we could say it was never winnable, so it wasn't worth, obviously, losing all of those American young men and a few women, I guess, at the time. But it would have been better to win in Vietnam, and the terrible price was paid by our defeat in Vietnam in 1975, and I don't think we need to pay that price. Sometimes if you can't win, you're going to, we will lose battles and wars in the future of America. But it's sure a heck of a lot better to win them, especially when you're fighting a brutal enemy, and especially when so much is at stake, with Iraq right there in the center of the Middle East and the shot in the arm that the jihadists would get from driving us out of Iraq.
So as we take a look at the midterm elections, and you wrote in the most recent edition of the Weekly Standard, by the way, how did this publication come about?
It's about 11 years old now. It was started by Fred Barnes, John Podhoretz, and me, and many colleagues, some of whom have got on to lesser things, like David Brooks at the New York Times, and others who are still with us. But Rupert Murdoch, News Corp, which Rupert Murdoch is chairman of, is the publisher of it, and We lose a little money each year, but less each year, we hope and trust. And it's a journal of opinion here in Washington, D.C. It has about 100,000 paid subscribers nationally, and a lot of people come to the website and read an awful lot of stuff for which they don't pay.
and we now get it early on Sunday morning, so we can talk about it in the Washington Journal Sunday.
Good.
But you quote in your editorial, in the first page is the editorial of the Weekly Standard, which is similar to what we used to see in the Union Leader, where they used to put their editorial in New Hampshire
right.
on the front page. Nancy Pelosi, the House Democratic leader, saying that the 2006 election campaign should not be about national security, and you begin by saying, too bad, it will be, and President Bush set the trap September 6, 2006. Explain.
Well, the president proposed in that speech new rules for the treatment of detainees, and after the Supreme Court's Hamden decision, also, I guess, new authorization for the wiretapping or eavesdropping on conversations with al-Qaeda types who are abroad. He would like, the Republican Party would like to have a big terror debate. I think they think that's an issue they have an advantage on. And I think so far the Democrats have fallen into that trap over the last week or two. Now, things could change. We're, what, 7 weeks still away from the election. And this little uptick for the president and for the Republicans may not last. But they've had a good 2 weeks, the Republicans, in framing this as a debate on who do you trust more to fight the jihadists, who do you trust more to be strong in defense of American interests, even if you think Bush has made mistakes in Iraq, even if you might think Iraq was a bad judgment call at the beginning. Moving forward, who do you trust more? Republicans do better in response to that poll question. So just from a practical point of view, it's smart of Republicans to try to get the electorate focused on that issue.
Before we get to student questions, I'm going to ask you the question I asked Dan Balls last week, which was, what is the narrative in this campaign? Because that often determines who wins and who loses.
I mean, the key underlying structural fact about this campaign is when one party controls the presidency and both houses of Congress, that party in modern history has always lost seats in an off-year election and often has lost lots of seats. You don't get much credit for the good things that happen when you govern, and you get a lot of blame for all the things you do that people don't like, you know? Governing is hard in a big, rambunctious democracy like ours, and that's the fundamental Republican problem. They've been in charge of everything for 4 years, and this is the first chance. In 2004, Bush ran against Kerry. People had a choice of who should be president for the next 4 years. Bush was able to win that. Now in 2006, they really have a chance to signal their unhappiness. And, you know, they don't, it's hard to get voters too alarmed about a Democratic House or a Democratic Senate.